"Are you Julian Croft?" The voice was small but carried an unnerving clarity in the cavernous lobby, a space designed to swallow sound and intimidate visitors. Julian Croft looked down. He hadn't even noticed the child until she spoke. A tiny island of color in a sea of black marble and brushed steel. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, with dark, unruly braids and a simple yellow dress that seemed too bright for the severe architecture of his corporate headquarters. In her arms she clutched a stuffed rabbit, its fur worn away in patches by years of anxious affection. For a moment, Julian was simply baffled. His world was meticulously curated to exclude such things. The unpredictable, the small, the messy. Children were not part of the equation. He stood at his full height, a man accustomed to making others feel insignificant, but the girl's gaze didn't waver. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue-gray, held his with a frankness no adult would dare. "I am," he finally answered, his voice the clipped, impatient instrument that had ended careers and crushed competitors. He expected her to be intimidated, to falter. She did not. She took a small, steadying breath. "You fired my mommy. Now we don't have money for food." The words, so simple and direct, landed with the force of a physical blow. Around them, the low hum of the lobby, the quiet footsteps of assistants, the whisper of stock tickers on digital displays, seemed to fall away into a vacuum of silence. 2 of Julian's security guards, enormous men hired for their imposing presence, hovered nearby, their expressions a comical mixture of bewilderment and helplessness. This was a situation their training had not covered. Julian's mind, a machine built for rapid calculation, raced through possibilities. It was a scam, obviously, a new and admittedly creative form of corporate panhandling. Someone had put her up to this, coached her on what to say. He felt a surge of cold anger at the audacity of it. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, the ice returning to his voice. He glanced at the guards. "Security will see you out." It was a dismissal, the final word. He had a meeting in 10 minutes, a billion-dollar merger to orchestrate. He did not have time for this pathetic street theater. He turned his back on her, a gesture he had perfected over a lifetime. It was his signature move, signaling the end of an interaction, the termination of a person's relevance. He expected to hear the child start to cry, the soft shuffling of the guards leading her away. Instead, he heard her voice again, this time louder, ringing with a desperate conviction that shattered the lobby's frozen silence and pierced the armor he had spent decades forging. "She said, 'You're my dad.'" Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. The receptionist's fingers froze over her keyboard. A courier mid-stride stopped so abruptly he nearly dropped his package. The entire self-important world of Croft Enterprises held its breath. Julian stopped dead, the words hitting him like a physical impact, echoing in the sudden, profound silence. He slowly turned back to face the child. The look on her face wasn't one of cunning or deceit. It was a raw, unfiltered plea. In that moment, surrounded by the towering symbols of his power, Julian Croft felt something he hadn't felt since he was a boy with nothing to his name. The terrifying, vertiginous sensation of losing control. The carefully constructed universe he commanded had just been breached not by a corporate raider or a market crash, but by a 5-year-old girl with his mother's eyes. 6 years earlier, the rain had been relentless. A gray sheet of water that had washed out the Hamptons charity gala Julian was supposed to be attending. He hated the Hamptons, but he hated disruptions to his schedule even more. Annoyed, he had returned to his office on a Saturday night, the one place where the world bent to his will. The building was a ghost ship, silent and dark, save for the emergency lights in the hallways. He was working his way through a hostile takeover bid from a German conglomerate, his mind a crystalline lattice of numbers and strategies, when the power flickered and died. A groan of protest escaped the building's steel skeleton as the backup generators failed to kick in. For the first time in its history, the Croft Enterprises tower was dark and silent. The absolute blackness was disorienting. Julian, a man who commanded light and information, was suddenly adrift. He used his phone's flashlight to navigate his way from his penthouse office down the emergency stairwell, his footsteps echoing in the concrete shaft. He was heading for the security hub in the sub-basement, a furious monologue already forming in his head for the head of maintenance who would be fired before sunrise. On the 24th floor, his light caught a flicker of movement. A woman was sitting on the landing, a book in her lap, a small, battery-powered lantern casting a warm, golden glow around her. She didn't seem frightened or even particularly bothered by the blackout. Her name was Elena Rojas. She worked in the corporate archives, a digital librarian who spent her days in the building's climate-controlled memory banks, a floor Julian didn't even know existed. She'd been working late on a personal project, organizing a collection of digitized historical maps. When the lights went out, she had simply lit her lantern and continued to read. He was immediately struck by her composure. His employees usually reacted to his presence with a mixture of fear and fawning. This woman simply looked up from her book, her expression one of mild curiosity, her eyes that same stormy blue-gray holding no trace of deference. "The building is on lockdown," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "I know," she replied, her voice soft. "The magnetic locks engage automatically. We're stuck until the system reboots." She gestured to the step beside her. "You might as well get comfortable. It could be a while." Against his better judgment, he did. For the next 2 hours they talked. Or rather, she talked, and he found himself to his astonishment listening. She spoke about her love for old things, for the stories hidden in forgotten documents and faded maps. She spoke not of money or power, but of history and connection. There was a quiet strength to her, a self-contained stillness that was the complete antithesis of his own restless, predatory energy. In the warm, isolated bubble of her lantern light, surrounded by the oppressive darkness, Julian felt an unfamiliar sensation, a crack in his armor. It became their secret. For the next 3 months, he would find reasons to work late, taking the elevator down to the 24th floor. Their encounters were brief, stolen moments in the quiet hum of the archives after everyone else had gone home. It was a complete departure from the sterile, transactional relationships he maintained with the string of supermodels and heiresses who occasionally graced his penthouse. With Elena, there was no pretense. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, and he found he had no desire to impress her with it. He was drawn to her mind, her passion for her work, the way she saw the world not as a series of assets to be acquired, but as a tapestry of stories to be understood. For the first time in his adult life, he was simply Julian, a man talking to a woman in a quiet room. It was a dangerous indulgence, a deviation from the rigid discipline of his life, and that was precisely why he craved it. The end came as abruptly as the beginning. One evening, Elena met him not with a smile, but with a look of profound, terrified hope. She told him she was pregnant. The words hit the sterile air of the archives and seemed to freeze it. Julian's mind, the cold, calculating machine, rebooted instantly. A child, a liability, a permanent, unbreakable connection to a life he could not control. It was a flaw in the design, a variable that threatened the entire system. He saw not a baby, but a series of headlines, lawsuits, a messy emotional entanglement that would compromise his empire. His original sin, the act from which all the subsequent cruelty flowed, wasn't born of malice, but of a pathological need for control. He didn't yell or threaten. He did something far worse. He became utterly, terrifyingly calm. "That's not possible," he said, the words stripped of all emotion. "Julian, I'm sure," she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. I hoped you would be happy." "Happiness is an irrelevant metric," he said, turning away from her, the invisible wall between them slamming back into place, thicker and colder than ever. "This is a complication. It needs to be handled." He never spoke to her again. The next day, he summoned Michael Vance, his head of legal, a man known as the Cleaner. Vance was a specialist in making problems disappear. Julian gave him his instructions in the detached language of a corporate directive. "There is a potential HR liability on the 24th floor. Her name is Elena Rojas. Initiate severance protocols. Standard non-disclosure. Ensure a clean break." Vance understood the subtext perfectly. He called Elena into a sterile conference room. He didn't mention Julian's name. He spoke of downsizing, of restructuring in the archival department. He pushed a severance agreement across the table, a generous sum with a thick non-disclosure clause buried in the legalese. Elena stared at the check, her heart sinking. She hadn't wanted his money. She had wanted him. She pushed the papers back across the table. "I don't want this," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I just need to talk to him." That was her mistake. Her refusal to be bought, to be neatly filed away, was seen not as a plea, but as a threat. Vance reported back to Julian that the employee was being uncooperative. Julian's response was a single, cold command. Then terminate for cause. Make sure it sticks. I want her gone by the end of the day. The termination was swift and brutal. Within hours, a fabricated report of Elena mishandling sensitive historical documents, a cardinal sin in her profession, was filed by her department head, a man eager to curry favor with the executive floor. 2 security guards escorted her from her desk. They didn't even let her pack her personal belongings. She was walked through the lobby, past the staring eyes of her former colleagues, a public spectacle of disgrace. Her keycard was deactivated, her corporate email account deleted, and her phone number blocked from the company system. She had been surgically, efficiently, and completely erased from Julian Croft's world. She tried to reach him for weeks, sending letters to the office that were intercepted by Vance's department, leaving messages with an assistant who had been instructed to delete them. Then, finally, broken and defeated, she disappeared, and Julian, with practiced, deliberate effort, forgot she had ever existed. Until now, standing in his silent lobby, staring into the face of a little girl with Elena's defiant, blue-gray eyes, he remembered everything. The immediate aftermath in the lobby was a study in controlled chaos. As if a spell had been broken, people began to move again, but their movements were stiff, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Whispers erupted like sparks in dry grass. Julian Croft, the man who was more of a legend than a person within his own company, had been brought to a dead stop by a 5-year-old girl. He did the only thing his training had ever taught him to do in a crisis. He re-established control. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to the nearest security guard. "Take the child to my personal waiting room on the 48th floor. Stay with her. Do not let her out of your sight. Give her whatever she wants. Juice. A tablet. I don't care." He then turned and strode toward his private elevator, his back ramrod straight, a silent dismissal of the entire affair. The elevator doors slid shut, encasing him in a mirrored box that reflected 1,000 images of a man whose composure was, for the first time in a decade, a complete and utter fraud. The moment he was back in the sterile sanctuary of his penthouse office, the facade cracked. He swept a multi-$1,000 tablet off his desk with a furious flick of his wrist. It shattered against the far wall. He paced the length of the room, a caged tiger, the city lights below mocking his sudden powerlessness. This was not a business problem. It was a contamination, a virus introduced into the clean room of his life. He hadn't thought of Elena Rojas in 6 years. He had paid a fortune to his legal team to ensure she would be a non-entity, a footnote in a terminated HR file. And yet, she had found a way to reach past his firewalls, past his lawyers, past his security, and strike at the very foundation of his identity with a weapon he couldn't counter, a child with his mother's eyes. He jabbed the intercom. "Get me Michael Vance. Now." Michael Vance arrived in under 3 minutes. He was a pale, slender man in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression perpetually neutral. Vance was not just the head of Julian's legal department, he was his cleaner, the architect of his perfectly insulated life. He entered the office, his eyes taking in the shattered tablet on the floor without a flicker of reaction. He had seen worse. "We have a situation," Julian said, his voice a low growl. "An extortion attempt. A woman I vaguely recall from the archives, a Rojas, has sent her child here with a ridiculous story." Vance nodded slowly. He had already heard. The entire building had heard. "The girl is secure on the 48th floor, he said calmly. "What are your instructions?" This was Julian's chance to show a sliver of humanity, to ask about the girl, to acknowledge the possibility. He did the opposite. He doubled down on the cruelty, burying the sliver of doubt under a mountain of indignant rage. It was the only way he knew how to protect himself. Find the woman. "I want a cease and desist order that will make her terrified to even breathe in my direction. I want a restraining order filed by noon tomorrow. Accuse her of harassment, stalking, extortion. I don't care what you have to use. And get a DNA test kit. We'll disprove this pathetic fantasy in a court of law, and then we'll sue her for defamation until she can't afford to buy a cup of coffee." He paused, his eyes cold as ice. "And Vance, make her an offer. A final one. Something small enough to be an insult. Tell her to take it, sign a permanent NDA, and disappear. If she refuses, tell her I will use every dollar I have to prove she is an unfit mother and take that child from her. Make sure she understands that is not a threat. It is a statement of fact." Vance simply nodded. "Consider it done." An hour later, Michael Vance stood outside the door of a third-floor walk-up in a tired brick building in Queens. The contrast with the sleek corporate power of Manhattan was jarring. Here the air smelled of fried onions and damp laundry. Children's toys were scattered in the hallway. This was the messy, unpredictable world Julian paid him a fortune to keep at bay. He knocked. Elena Rojas opened the door. She was still beautiful, but the years had etched lines of worry around her eyes and mouth. She had been pacing the small apartment for the past hour, a maelstrom of fear and hope churning within her. When she saw the man in the expensive suit, a man who radiated a cold corporate authority, the hope began to die. "Elena Rojas?" Vance asked, though he knew perfectly well who she was. He smiled, a thin, reptilian stretching of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Michael Vance, legal counsel for Croft Enterprises. May I come in?" He didn't wait for an answer, stepping into her small, clean living room. His eyes swept over the space, cataloging the worn furniture, the second-hand books, the framed crayon drawings on the wall. It was a home filled with love, but devoid of resources. It was, in his professional opinion, a very weak position. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Croft," he began, placing his briefcase on her small coffee table. He was disturbed by the incident in his lobby today. It has been categorized as an act of corporate harassment. Elena flinched as if he'd struck her. "Harassment? I sent my daughter there because he wouldn't answer my letters. He blocked my calls. What was I supposed to do?" Vance ignored her, opening his briefcase with a series of precise clicks. "Mr. Croft denies any and all of your baseless allegations. However, in the interest of avoiding a public nuisance, he is prepared to offer you a one-time final settlement." He slid a check across the table. It was for $20,000, just enough to be tempting for someone in her position, but insultingly low for a man of Julian's means. "In exchange, you will sign this." He produced a thick document. "It's a standard non-disclosure agreement. You will retract your claims. You will never contact Mr. Croft or any of his associates again, and you will relocate to a distance of no less than 500 miles from New York City." Elena stared at the check, then at the document, her heart pounding. This was not how it was supposed to go. "And Lily," she whispered, her voice cracking. "His daughter?" Vance's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "The child is a non-issue. Mr. Croft has authorized a paternity test to legally disprove your claim, and I must advise you, Ms. Rojas, if you persist in this fantasy, he will respond with the full force of his legal power. We will countersue. We will subpoena your friends, your former employers, your landlord. We will paint you as an unstable, manipulative extortionist, and we will petition the court for a competency hearing to have you declared an unfit mother. You cannot win a war against a man like Julian Croft. He will burn your entire world to the ground to protect his own." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was threatening to take her child, his child, away from her. The last ember of hope she had clung to was extinguished, replaced by a cold, terrifying dread. The suffering she had endured for the past 6 years was nothing compared to this. This was a new level of hell, a direct and brutal escalation of the injustice she had already borne. The world swam before her eyes. Just then, the door opened, and a uniformed Croft security guard gently ushered her daughter Lily inside. The guard nodded curtly at Vance and left, closing the door behind him. Lily ran to her mother, clutching a new, expensive-looking teddy bear, a hollow gift from the man who was now threatening to destroy their lives. She saw the tears welling in her mother's eyes, and her happy expression crumbled. "Mommy?" Lily asked, her small voice full of concern. "Are you sad?" Elena hugged her daughter tightly, burying her face in her dark hair, the legal documents on the table, a declaration of war against her, and the innocent child in her arms. For 3 days, Julian operated on a razor's edge of controlled fury. He delegated with brutal efficiency, his meetings became interrogations, and the entire 48th floor seemed to be held in a state of suspended animation, terrified of attracting his attention. He threw himself into his work, using the familiar comforting logic of multi-billion-dollar deals to drown out the insistent whisper of a 6-year-old girl's voice. He had given his orders. Vance was handling it. The problem had been contained, categorized, and was being systematically dismantled. It was a matter of procedure now. He told himself this 100 times a day. The DNA test was a formality, a piece of legal ammunition. Vance had arranged for a court-approved technician to take a sample from Lily at Elena's apartment and from Julian in his office. It was a sterile, impersonal process. The technician, a nervous young man, barely met Julian's eyes as he swabbed the inside of his cheek. Julian felt nothing but a cold clinical detachment. He was simply providing the data that would confirm his reality and obliterate theirs. The results were delivered on Friday afternoon in a sealed manila envelope. Vance placed it on Julian's desk with the quiet reverence of a priest placing a sacred text on an altar. "As requested," he said. "Open it," Julian commanded, not looking up from his screen. "Read the conclusion." He didn't want to touch it. He wanted the information delivered to him like a stock report, a simple number he could file away. Vance slit the envelope open with a silver letter opener. There was a long pause. Julian finally looked up, irritated by the delay. "Well, Michael Vance," a man who had delivered news of federal indictments and catastrophic market crashes without a flicker of emotion, looked pale. He cleared his throat. "It says, based on the analysis of the submitted samples, the probability of paternity is 99.9999%. The numbers hung in the air, seeming to warp the very atmosphere of the room. Julian stared at Vance, a slow, cold fire starting in the pit of his stomach. "That's not possible," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Read it again." "Probability of paternity," Vance repeated, his voice now a strained monotone, "is 99.9999%. Julian shot out of his chair. The lab was compromised. She bribed someone. This is what they do, people like her. They find a weakness in the system and they exploit it. He began to pace, the contained energy of the past 3 days exploding into frantic motion. "I want the name of the lab. I want the name of every technician who handled those samples. I want a full financial audit of every single one of them, going back 10 years. Find out who she paid, Vance. Find the connection." "Julian," Vance said, his voice steady, trying to pull his client back from the brink. "This is one of the most reputable labs in the country. They handle cases for the federal government. The chain of custody was perfect. Tampering would be virtually impossible." "Nothing is impossible," Julian roared, slamming his hand on his desk. "Only expensive. Find the price." Vance did not argue. He simply left the envelope on the desk and quietly exited the office, leaving Julian alone with the ticking time bomb of a single, undeniable fact. For the rest of the afternoon, he tried to work, but the numbers on his screen blurred, replaced by the infuriating sequence, 99.999999%. It was a number that defied his will. It was a fact that could not be bullied, bought, or fired. His entire life was built on the principle that reality was negotiable. This was not. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across his office, he found himself walking over to the window. He looked down at the city, but he didn't see the river of lights, the testament to his power. Instead, his mind drifted back to the 24th floor, to the warm glow of a battery-powered lantern in the dark. He remembered Elena. He tried to reconcile the memory of the quiet, intelligent woman who loved old maps with the desperate, manipulative extortionist he had painted her to be. The two images wouldn't merge. He remembered her face when she told him she was pregnant. It wasn't the triumphant look of a gold digger who had trapped a billionaire. It was fear, yes, but it was also hope, a fragile, foolish hope that he would be happy. He pulled open a drawer in his desk and took out a file Vance had prepared. It was the surveillance report on Elena and Lily. He flipped past the financial details, the list of their meager assets. He stopped at a photograph. It was taken from a distance, grainy and invasive. It showed Lily on a park swing, her mother pushing her from behind. In the photo, Lily is looking up, her head thrown back in a laugh, her face pure, unadulterated joy. Elena is looking down at her, and the expression on her face is one of fierce, all-consuming love. There was no artifice in it, no hint of a long con. There was only a mother and a daughter in a shabby city park, finding a moment of happiness in a world that had given them very little. He stared at the girl's laughing face, at her eyes, which even in the blurry photo seemed to hold a familiar light. He was still Julian Croft, the titan of industry. He was still angry. He was still in denial. But it was different now. The solid ground of his certainty had been shattered, and beneath it was a dark, terrifying chasm of doubt. He closed the file. The question was no longer just about a legal threat. It was deeper, more personal. He had built his empire on the foundation of absolute truth in numbers, and the numbers, for the first time in his life, were telling him a story he didn't want to believe. The doubt was a splinter under a fingernail, a small, persistent irritant that Julian couldn't ignore. For 2 days he tried to function, to immerse himself in the abstract beauty of a leveraged buyout. But the 99.99999% echoed in his head. The number was an absolute, and his world was not built on absolutes, but on narratives he created and controlled. He realized that trying to fight the DNA result itself was a fool's errand. A man like him did not challenge science, he challenged people. So, he shifted his focus. If the girl was his, then another fact became glaringly obvious. He had been lied to, or at the very least critical information had been withheld. His rage, which had been a wild, unfocused storm, now had a direction. He would investigate the breach, not the biological one, but the informational one. He started where all modern life begins and ends, the digital trail. Elena had claimed she tried to contact him. He had never received a single email, a single voicemail, a single text. In his world, that was impossible. His communication systems were a fortress, designed to let in exactly what he wanted and nothing else. He bypassed Vance, his official channel, knowing the lawyer would only show him the clean, sanitized version of events. Julian needed the raw data. He summoned Arthur Pennington to his office. Arthur was a relic from a previous era, the head of IT infrastructure who had been with the company since it was just a handful of desktops in a rented office. He was one of the few people who wasn't terrified of Julian, having known him when he was a ruthless but still mortal young man. Arthur was loyal to the system, not to the politics, and he valued data integrity above all else. Arthur, Julian began, foregoing any pleasantries. I need you to pull the complete server archives from 6 years ago. Specifically, all inbound communication logs for a 3-month period starting in October. I'm looking for anything, emails, server-level message blocks, everything, from an external address belonging to an Elena Rojas. Arthur, a man with a shock of white hair and thick glasses, typed the query into the secure laptop he'd brought with him. Rojas, he muttered. The name is familiar. Archives, 24th floor. Terminated for cause, wasn't she? Data mishandling. That's the official story, Julian said, his voice flat. I'm interested in the unofficial one. Find the messages. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the office was the soft clicking of Arthur's keyboard. Julian stood at the window, his arms crossed, waiting. He felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. He was pulling at a thread, and he had no idea what would unravel. Well, this is peculiar, Arthur said finally, peering at his screen. Julian turned. What is it? She sent you emails, Arthur said. A lot of them. 23 to be exact, over a period of 6 weeks. He pointed to the screen. They all came in, hit our primary server, and were immediately rerouted to a digital quarantine folder, flagged as harassment, and then permanently deleted. None of them ever reached your personal inbox. Julian felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Who authorized the filter? Arthur typed a few more commands. His eyebrows shot up. The directive was actioned from a senior administrator account. But the request came directly from Michael Vance's office. It's all logged here. He filed a formal request with IT to block all communications from her email and phone number, citing an ongoing security concern with a disgruntled former employee, Vance. Of course, his cleaner had been a little too thorough, but it felt too simple, too neat. Vance was his instrument. He did not act without orders. Julian's orders had been to handle it, to ensure a clean break. He hadn't explicitly ordered a communications blackout, but it was the logical extension of his command. This was still his fault, his sin, but something still felt wrong, like a missing piece of a puzzle. What about her termination? Julian pressed. The data mishandling charge. Pull the incident report, I want to see the proof. This took Arthur longer. He had to dig into the old HR servers, a digital graveyard of terminated careers. Finally, he found it. Here we go. The report was filed by her direct supervisor, a Mr. Henderson. It claims she improperly downloaded and attempted to remove classified historical financial records from the archival server. And the server logs? Julian asked. Do they confirm that download? Arthur's fingers flew across the keyboard. He fell silent, his eyes scanning lines of code and timestamps. A frown creased his forehead. No, he said slowly. In fact, the logs show the exact opposite. On the day in question, Ms. Rojas's terminal accessed only public domain map files. The files Henderson accused her of stealing. They were accessed and downloaded all right, but the IP address that did it wasn't on the 24th floor. It was up here, on the 48th. Julian stared at Arthur, the pieces beginning to click into place with sickening clarity. Whose terminal? Arthur ran the final trace. The answer came back in a single line of stark, damning text on the screen. He looked up at Julian, his expression grim. It was Michael Vance's machine, Julian. The download, the supervisor's report, the IT block, and it was all orchestrated by him. He framed her. The information landed in the silent office with the force of a physical explosion. For a full minute, Julian didn't speak. He simply stared at the line of text on Arthur's screen, the digital proof of a betrayal so profound it was almost incomprehensible. Vance. It wasn't just a legal strategy. It was a conspiracy. A quiet, meticulous coup that had been waged against his life without him even knowing it. The cold knot of dread in his stomach twisted into something white-hot and sharp. Rage. But it was a new kind of rage. It wasn't the impatient anger of a CEO whose orders were defied. It was the elemental fury of a man who discovers his entire reality has been a carefully constructed lie. He dismissed Arthur with a curt nod, his mind already several steps ahead. The what was now clear. The how was laid out in the server logs, but the why remained a gaping, illogical hole in the center of it all. Vance was a creature of pure, transactional logic. What could he possibly gain from such a complex and risky deception? It wasn't money. Julian paid him an obscene salary. It wasn't a promotion. Vance already occupied the highest legal position in the company. As Julian paced the length of his office, the city lights beginning to blur into streaks of neon below. Fragments of memory began to surface, details he had dismissed as insignificant for years. Vance hadn't always been his chief counsel. He had started as Julian's executive assistant, a quiet, hyper-efficient young man who anticipated his every need. He remembered Vance's unnerving devotion, the way his eyes would follow Julian in meetings, the almost worshipful tone he used when speaking of Julian's business acumen. He remembered Vance's subtle but persistent disdain for the women Julian dated, the quiet satisfaction on his face when a relationship ended. Julian had always seen it as the mark of a loyal subordinate, a man whose entire world revolved around his boss's success. He saw now with chilling clarity that he had mistaken obsession for loyalty. Vance hadn't been protecting the company. He had been protecting him, or rather his twisted, idealized version of him. Elena and the child were not a threat to the business. They were a threat to the shrine Vance had built in his own mind. The revelation was sickening. It turned his world inside out. He, Julian Croft, the master manipulator, the man who controlled everything, had been the puppet in a quiet, pathetic drama orchestrated by his own lawyer. The fury solidified into a cold, diamond-hard purpose. He would not confront Vance with rage. Rage was messy, emotional. It would give Vance a target to react to. No, he would dismantle him with the same tool Vance himself had used. Cold, inescapable fact. He would set a trap using the truth as bait. He buzzed his assistant. "Diane, please ask Mr. Vance to come to my office. Tell him I need to finalize our strategy regarding the Rojas matter." 5 minutes later, Michael Vance entered the office, his face a mask of calm professionalism. He held a leather-bound folder. "Julian," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "I was just reviewing the preliminary motions for the defamation suit. I think we have a very strong—" "Sit down, Michael," Julian said, his voice quiet. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Julian remained standing, a deliberate shift in their established power dynamic. Vance sat, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Julian let the silence stretch, the tension in the room thickening until it was almost palpable. Then, he began. "I've been reviewing the archives," Julian said, his tone conversational. "It's fascinating what you can find in old data logs. For instance, I found 23 emails sent from Elena Rojas to my personal account 6 years ago. They never arrived." He paused, watching Vance's face. The lawyer's expression didn't change, but a small muscle in his jaw began to twitch. "They were blocked by an IT directive. A directive you authorized." Vance cleared his throat. "A standard security measure. She was a disgruntled employee. I was protecting you from harassment." "Protecting me," Julian repeated, the words dripping with a soft, dangerous irony. "Of course. You were also protecting me when you had her fired, I imagine." "I looked at that report, Michael. The one accusing her of data theft, a complete fabrication. The logs show the files were downloaded from your machine here on the 48th floor." The color began to drain from Vance's face. His mask of composure was cracking, revealing the pale, frightened man beneath. That's That's circumstantial. My terminal could have been compromised. Was it also compromised when you coerced her supervisor into signing a false report? Julian pressed on, relentless, his voice like the steady chipping of a chisel on stone. Was it compromised when you intercepted her letters? When you blocked her phone number? Was your entire life's work just one long, unfortunate compromise, Michael? It was then that Vance broke. The years of repressed obsessive devotion curdled into a pathetic whining confession. I did it for you, he blurted out, his voice cracking, the smooth lawyer gone, replaced by a petulant child. Don't you see? She was a weakness, a distraction, a nobody from the archives. She would have ruined you, dragged you down with her sentimentality, with her messiness. He stood up, his hands pleading. A child? It would have been the end of everything you've built. I saw it. I saw the threat and I neutralized it. I did what you were unwilling to do yourself. I protected you. I kept you pure. The confession was more grotesque than Julian could have ever imagined. The sheer delusional arrogance of it was staggering. This man had appointed himself the high priest of Julian's life, sacrificing a woman and a child on the altar of his own twisted worship. The rage inside Julian vanished, replaced by a profound, bottomless disgust. He felt dirty, as if he had been living in a house with a hidden, rotting core for years and had only just discovered the stench. He looked at the man he had trusted implicitly, the man who had shaped his life in secret, and he felt nothing but a cold, empty pity. You're a parasite, Michael, Julian said, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through Vance's babbling like a razor. You fed on my life, and you tried to poison it to suit your own pathetic needs. You didn't protect me. You neutered me. You stole 6 years of my life. You stole my daughter. He walked to his desk and pressed the intercom. Diane, send security to my office. Mr. Vance's employment at this company is terminated, effective immediately. He is to be escorted from the premises. He will not be permitted to collect any personal items. They will be forwarded to him. Vance stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief, then horror. Julian, no, please, after everything I've done for you. Security is on its way, Michael, Julian said, turning his back on him, the ultimate final dismissal. It's over. He heard the heavy footsteps of the guards in the hall, the quiet, humiliating exchange, and then the door closing, leaving him in absolute silence. He was alone. He had won. The villain was vanquished. But the victory felt hollow, a new kind of desolation. He walked to his desk and picked up the grainy surveillance photo of Lily laughing on the swing. He stared at her face, this tiny stranger who was his blood, his daughter. The full, crushing weight of the truth finally landed on him. He hadn't just been negligent. He had been a fool, a king in a kingdom of one, so obsessed with control that he failed to see he was the one being controlled. And the price of that blindness was 6 years with this laughing little girl. 6 years he could never get back. The victory over Vance brought no relief, only a cold, desolate clarity. Julian sat in his leather chair, in the silence of his office at the top of the world, and felt utterly empty. He had excised the cancer, but the disease had been a part of him for so long that its absence was an open wound. For years he had lived in a fortress, believing he was the king, only to discover his prime minister was a traitor, and the walls were an illusion. Firing Vance, as dramatic and final as it was only the first step. It was an act of punishment, not atonement. It fixed nothing. It didn't return the 6 lost years. It didn't erase the pain he had caused Elena, or the life he had stolen from his daughter, Lily. An impulse born of this new terrible clarity took hold of him. He didn't call his driver. He went down to the subterranean garage, a place he hadn't set foot in for years, and found the one car that wasn't a statement of status, a simple black sedan he kept for emergencies. Driving himself was a strange, almost forgotten act. The streets of Manhattan, which he usually viewed from a shielded distance in the back seat, now felt urgent and real. Every red light was a test of his newfound patience. He had no plan, no strategy. For the first time in his professional life, he was operating purely on instinct, an instinct that pulled him away from his world of steel and glass and toward a brick apartment building in Queens. When he knocked on Elena's door, the sound of his own knuckles on the painted wood seemed unnaturally loud. He carried no lawyers, no settlements, no checks. In his hand, he held only a single thin file containing the proof of Vance's betrayal, the copies of the blocked emails, the IT report exposing the fraudulent firing. It was all he had to offer. The truth. Elena opened the door. When she saw him, her face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, fear, and then a cold, contained anger. She instinctively positioned herself to block the view of the apartment's interior, a human wall protecting her child. "What do you want?" she said, her voice low and steady, stripped of any of the softness he remembered. "Elena, His voice, the voice that commanded boardrooms and cowed billionaires, failed him. He had to start again. "I need to talk to you, please. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to explain." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face, looking for the trap. Seeing only a man who looked exhausted and strangely defeated, she stepped back, letting him in. The apartment was small but impeccably clean, and filled with a warm light that seemed to come not just from the windows, but from the walls themselves. Children's toys were neatly stored in a box in the corner. It smelled of cinnamon and home. He stood in the middle of the small living room, feeling large and out of place, an intruder from another universe. He didn't sit. He didn't have the right. "I know what happened," he began, his voice hoarse. "I know why you could never reach me. I know why you were fired." He held the file out to her. "It's not an excuse. There is no excuse for what I did or what I failed to do, but it's the truth." With trembling hands, she took the file and opened it. She read the email headers, her own desperate words from 6 years ago, each one stamped with blocked and deleted. She saw the IT report that laid out the frame-up, Michael Vance's name appearing again and again like a curse. She looked up, her face pale, her eyes wide with the enormity of the betrayal. "He did all this?" she whispered. "Yes," Julian said, "and I was too arrogant and blind a fool to see it. I built a system around myself to insulate me from messiness, and he used it to insulate me from the truth. When you told me you were pregnant, I panicked. I saw you and the baby as a complication, a threat to my control. So I gave the order to handle it. I turned your fate over to a monster because I was too much of a coward to face the consequence of my own actions. He erased you, and I let him. The fault isn't his, Elena. It's mine." The confession hung in the air between them. It was more than she'd expected, more honest, more brutal. But honesty couldn't erase 6 years of struggle, 6 years of believing the man she had loved had discarded her like trash. "And now what?" she said, her voice gaining strength, the pain turning to a righteous anger. "You show up here with your proof and expect that to fix everything? You destroyed me, Julian. You had me humiliated. I lost my career, my friends, my home. I had to raise our daughter alone, counting every penny, terrified we'd be evicted at any moment. Do you know what it's like to have to choose between buying medicine and buying food? I know I don't," he said, his voice low. "But I can fix that. The money. I can give you whatever you need. A house, a trust, whatever you need, whatever Lily needs forever." It was the wrong thing to say. The offer, meant as an act of reparation, sounded as it always had, like a transaction. Elena recoiled as if she'd been slapped. "My God, you still don't get it, do you?" she said, a short, bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I never wanted your money, I wanted you. Lily didn't need a trust fund, she needed a father. You can't just walk in here and write a check and expect 6 years of abandonment to disappear." She was right. He saw it instantly. He was trying to solve an emotional problem with a financial solution. It was the only method he knew, and it was utterly useless here. He had to offer something more. He had to offer the one thing he truly valued, the one thing that would be a true sacrifice, himself. His time, his pride, his control. "You're right," he said, and the surrender in his voice was total and genuine. "I'm sorry. You are absolutely right. So forget the money. Forget all of it. Just tell me, what can I do? Not to buy your forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but to start earning it. What does Lily need? What do you need? I'll do anything." This was the moment, the true act of atonement. He wasn't dictating terms. He was ceding all power to her. He, Julian Croft, was asking. He was on his knees, metaphorically, stripped of his arrogance and power, waiting for her judgment. Elena looked at him for a long time, the anger in her eyes warring with the hurt and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The bedroom door creaked open, and Lily peeked out, her eyes sleepy, the worn stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. "Mommy?" she said in a small voice. "Who's that man?" Elena turned to her daughter, and her face softened. She knelt and hugged the little girl. After a moment, she looked up at Julian over her daughter's head. "She needs a father who doesn't run away," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. but it was as strong as steel. She needs someone to push her on the swing, someone to read her bedtime stories, someone to show up for her school recital. She needs time, consistency. Can you give her that? It wasn't a question about finance. It was a question about character, about sacrifice, about whether he could dismantle the life he had built to make room for a new one. Yes, Julian said, without a shred of hesitation. The answer came from a deep place inside him he hadn't known existed. I can, if you'll let me. Please, let me try. The downfall of Michael Vance was not a dramatic spectacle. It was a quiet, thorough erasure, the same kind he had once engineered for Elena. Julian's legal team, acting on his explicit and ruthless instructions, built a case of corporate fraud and gross misconduct against him. Faced with irrefutable digital evidence, Vance was disbarred. He lost his license, his reputation, and the lavish lifestyle Julian's patronage had provided. He faded into obscurity, a ghost in the world of high finance he had once haunted, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in the hushed corridors of power. But Julian took no satisfaction in his former counsel's ruin. It was merely a loose end, a final piece of toxic baggage to be jettisoned before the real work could begin. That work was far more difficult than any corporate takeover he had ever orchestrated. It was the slow, painstaking, and often clumsy process of becoming a father. His first attempts were exercises in awkwardness. On his first designated Saturday with Lily, he arrived at Elena's apartment in a chauffeured town car, bringing with him a doll from FAO Schwartz that was larger than the child herself. Lily looked at the gift with wide, intimidated eyes, then hid behind her mother's legs, clutching her worn-out rabbit. It was a stark lesson. He couldn't buy his way into her life, so he began to learn. He traded his bespoke suits for jeans and sneakers. He learned that pushing a swing required a rhythm he didn't possess, often sending it lurching sideways. He learned that 5-year-olds have very specific, non-negotiable opinions about how peanut butter sandwiches should be cut, crusts off, diagonally. He tried to read her a bedtime story from an iPad, only to have her small hand push it away in favor of a tattered copy of a book about a runaway bunny. He sat on the edge of her small bed, his large frame perched awkwardly, and read the simple words aloud. His voice, usually so confident and commanding, sounding hesitant and strange in the quiet room. These were moments filled with mistakes, but each mistake was a lesson, a brick being laid in the foundation of a trust that had been shattered before it was ever built. For Elena, the process was just as fraught. Watching Julian with Lily was a constant battle between the deep-seated fear of being abandoned again and the flicker of hope that this change was real. She didn't make it easy for him. She corrected his clumsy attempts to braid Lily's hair. She questioned his decisions. She watched his every move with the vigilance of a hawk. She was testing him, waiting for the first sign that this was a temporary whim, that the moment it became too difficult, he would retreat back to the safety of his penthouse. But he didn't. He kept showing up. He came to her parent-teacher conference, sitting in a comically small chair while Lily's kindergarten teacher talked about her love of finger painting. He was there with a bucket and sponge when Lily got sick in the middle of the night. Slowly, painstakingly, he was proving with actions, not words, that he was there to stay. 6 months later, Julian Croft's life was unrecognizable. He had sold the cold, cavernous penthouse overlooking the city. He'd moved into a brownstone in Brooklyn, one with a small walled garden in the back. He had ruthlessly cut his work schedule in half, delegating the day-to-day operations of his empire to a team of trusted executives, much to their astonishment. He now understood that the most important merger of his life wasn't happening in a boardroom, but in a small kitchen, over a breakfast of slightly burned pancakes. He found that happiness wasn't the roar of the trading floor, but the sound of Lily's laughter as he chased her around the garden. He discovered a contentment not in the closing of a billion-dollar deal, but in the quiet moment at the end of the day when he and Elena would sit on the couch after Lily was asleep, a comfortable silence between them that was more intimate than any conversation he'd ever had. The wall of fear and resentment between them had not vanished overnight, but it had been slowly dismantled, piece by piece, by the shared, ordinary moments of building a life together. They were a family, forged not in a moment of passion, but in the deliberate daily choice to heal, to trust, and to love. Years later, the family was complete, happy, and whole. Julian, the man who once saw people as assets and liabilities, used his vast fortune not to acquire more companies but to build things that mattered. On Lily's suggestion, he funded the construction of a state-of-the-art public library in their old Queens neighborhood, a place filled with light and books and quiet corners for dreaming. He had become the man he was always meant to be, a present father, a loving husband, a man whose greatest wealth was not in his bank account but in a home filled with laughter, where an 8-year-old girl reminded him every day that the most important things in life are, in fact, the simplest. Julian's journey taught him the final most important lesson. True success is not measured in business deals or stock portfolios, but in human connection, in the capacity to love and be loved in return, proving that it is never too late to repair the mistakes of the past and build a future based on what truly matters. Did you enjoy the story of Julian, Elena, and Lily? This beautiful story teaches us that it's never too late to find true love and build a family. Sometimes second chances come when we least expect them. And, as we've seen, love can overcome any obstacle when there is a will to change and fight for what really matters. Julian completely transformed his life for the love of his daughter and Elena, proving that happiness is not in money or success, but in the simple moments shared with the people we love. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends and family who also enjoy romantic stories full of hope. Your support helps us a lot to continue creating content that touches the heart. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any new story of love and family. Let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. We love knowing that we have friends from all over the world who enjoy our stories. A big hug. See you in the next one.